She fell on a mountain road in Colorado with $17 in her hand, a dead man's letters in her bag, and nowhere on God's earth to go. Three mountain men came riding down out of the dusk and stopped their horses above her. The biggest one did not dismount. He only looked at her the way a man looks at a prayer he had stopped saying 5 years ago, and he said 6 words that changed the rest of her life. "You took the wrong road, ma'am." But the wrong road, as it turned out, was the only road that was ever going to bring her home. This is the story of Adeline Thorncroft and the winter she walked into on a mountain called Elk Hollow. The thin autumn light was failing fast over the Colorado high country when Adeline Thorncroft stumbled on the pine root that would change the rest of her life. She did not fall right away. She staggered 3 more steps, one hand reaching for a tree that was not there, and then the ground came up to meet her, the way the ground meets anyone who has walked too far in the wrong kind of shoes. Her knees struck first, then her palms. The carpet bag slipped from her fingers and rolled once against a fallen log. And out of the small beaded reticule at her wrist tumbled $17 in silver and crumpled paper, the last $17 of her whole life in this world, rolling across the forest floor like dried leaves in the last good breath of October. She did not cry. She had used up her crying somewhere between Chicago and Omaha, and what was left in her now was only a dry kind of stillness. The stillness of a woman who has finally understood that no one was coming. That was when she heard the horses, 3 of them moving down the mountain at a walk. She could feel the hoof beats through the palms of her hands before she could hear them clearly. Iron shoes striking stone leather, creaking the soft blow of a horse that has worked hard and is headed home. She tried to lift her head and could not quite manage it. Her hair honey blonde and once carefully pinned that morning in a Boston boarding house mirror had come loose and hung across her face like a veil she did not remember putting on. The riders came around the bend and stopped. For 30 seconds, nobody spoke. 30 seconds is a very long time on a mountain in the dying light of the year, and Adeline lay there in the pine needles counting her own heartbeats because counting them was the only thing she could think to do. Then a voice came down from above her, low and slow, and carrying the careful weight of a man who did not waste words. "Ma'am, you took the wrong road. There is nothing up there but the mountain and the winter coming in." She managed to raise her face at last, and what she saw silhouetted against the bruised color of the western sky was 3 mountain men on 3 horses, and the one in front was the biggest man she had ever been near in all her 22 years on this earth. He sat asaddled the way a church sits on its foundation. Broad through the shoulder, long in the leg, with an amber light behind his eyes that was something like a candle burning in a far window of a house you had been walking toward for a long, long time. He wore a wide-brim hat pushed back against his dark hair. His hands rested quiet on the pommel. He was not hurrying her answer. He was not hurrying anything. Behind him, a leaner rider in a fringed buckskin coat watched her with green eyes that did not blink. And behind that one, a younger man with sun-streaked hair and the easy grin of somebody who had never quite learned how to be grim about a hard world was already swinging down out of the saddle. The young one reached her first. He unbuttoned his heavy buffalo coat and settled it over her shoulders without asking. "Easy there, ma'am. You are shaking so hard, you are going to rattle your teeth loose. What is your name?" She tried to say it. On the third try, it came out. "Adeline. Adeline Thorncroft." "Adeline," he said, and the way he said it was like he was tasting the word to see if he liked it. "I am Silas Hale. That is my brother Wyatt there keeping watch, and the one up front who looks like God carved him out of a mountain is Caleb. You are in safer company than you know, Miss Thorncroft, but we need to get you home before the cold eats you alive." Before we go any farther down this mountain with Adeline and the 3 brothers who have just found her, I want to tell you that if you are new to this channel, you belong here too. Subscribe so you do not miss a single Frontier story, and drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from tonight. It means more to me than I can say to know you are out there. Now let us go back to Boston 3 months earlier and see how a seamstress with $17 ended up crawling in the pine needles of Colorado territory. Boston in the summer of 1878 was a city eating itself alive. The panic that had started 5 years before had finally reached the small shops of Washington Street, and one Tuesday morning in July, Henderson, in Daughter's Fine Dressmaking, locked its door for the last time. Adeline Thorncroft stood on the sidewalk with her sewing basket and her silver thimble and $92 in savings, and she looked up at the painted sign above the door, and she understood that the last roof over her head in this world was about to come down. Her mother and father had both been buried in the same week 3 years earlier when the scarlet fever came through the tenements. She had been 19 years old. She had left the girls' school on Beacon Hill and taken a seat at Henderson's cutting table, and there she had stayed, working honest hours, sleeping in a narrow room in a boarding house run by a kind old woman named Mrs. Henley, saving every coin she could spare against the day the world would turn on her again. It had turned on her now. She answered the advertisement in the Boston Herald on a Tuesday and got the first letter back by Friday. The advertisement read like a prayer that somebody else had said for her. Honest man in Colorado seeks a patient wife, mercantile business, home-built hearth-warm future waiting. Write to Vernon Ashford, Colorado Springs. His first letter was written in a flowing hand on heavy cream paper, and it opened with the words, "Dear Miss Thorncroft, forgive a stranger for writing to you as if we have already sat at the same table." Adeline read it 3 times by the light of a single tallow candle and felt something that had been frozen inside her for 3 years begin to thaw. The letters came twice a week after that for 6 months. He wrote about a white picket fence and a parlor with a rosewood piano he was saving to buy her. He wrote about a mercantile on Tremont Street where the shelves were lined with bolts of gingham and jars of sweet molasses. He wrote about the snow on the Front Range and how it caught the morning light. He wrote about being lonely, and he wrote it so plainly that she believed him because she was lonely too. Only at the very end, in the last letter, before she boarded the train, did Vernon Ashford mention money. He was expanding the mercantile, he said. There was an opportunity to buy an adjacent lot. If his dear Adeline happened to have any small savings she could contribute, they would build it together as partners, as husband and wife. $75 would be enough, he wrote. $75 would change everything. She packed her trunk. She folded her mother's Bible at the bottom. She wrapped the silver thimble with the letters MT engraved on the rim, Margaret Thorncroft, her mother dead these 3 years, and she tucked the thimble into the small reticule that would never leave her wrist. She laid the wedding dress she had sewn with her own hands across the top of the trunk, white muslin with tiny seed pearls at the throat, a dress she had cut and stitched after midnight for 60 straight nights. And then, at the very last hour, something she could not name stopped her hand. She did not send Vernon Ashford the $75. Instead, she gave the money to Mrs. Henley, the old landlady, to hold in a tin box under her bed. "Send it after me," Adeline had said. "When I write and tell you, I am settled and safe." Mrs. Henley had promised. And Adeline had boarded the train west with $17 in her reticule and her whole heart in her throat. The train to Colorado Springs should have connected at Copper Ridge Station. Instead, the engine broke an axle outside of Julesburg, and by the time Adeline's car rolled into the little whistle stop beneath the mountain, the westbound she needed had been gone 2 hours. The station clerk looked at her over his spectacles and shook his head the way men shake their heads at women who have already lost. It to westbound in 3 days, $22. Adeline counted her 17 in front of him because she could not believe the number had not grown on its own. The clerk told her to clear the platform. He had work to do. She walked into the main street of Copper Ridge with her carpet bag banging against her knee. The town was small, dusty, and smelled of wood smoke and horse. False front buildings leaned against each other. A saloon piano was playing a tune she half recognized. She asked a woman on the boardwalk where she might find lodging she could afford, and the woman pointed her to a general store with the name Hollister painted above the door. Alden Hollister was a careful man with kind eyes and hair gone gray at the temples. When Adeline walked into his store and asked him if he knew of a boarding house cheaper than Mrs. Whitlock's, He looked at her with the attention of a man who can tell when a customer is really asking a different question underneath. "Where are you headed, Miss Colorado Springs? I am to be married to a merchant there, a Mr. Vernon Ashford." Alden Hollister went very still behind his counter. Then he called over his shoulder for his wife to come out from the back room. "Say that name again for me, miss." "Vernon Ashford." His wife came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a tall, thin woman with the gentleness of people who have lost a child once and never stop being careful with strangers. She looked at Adeline's traveling dress and her dusty boots and the hopeful exhaustion in her face, and her eyes filled with a slow and awful kind of sorrow. "Oh, child," Mrs. Hollister said quietly. "Oh, you poor child." Alden Hollister came around the counter. He did not touch her. He just stood where she could see him clearly and told her the truth in the same quiet voice a doctor uses when there is nothing more to be done. Miss Thorncroft, the man who wrote those letters, came through Copper Ridge 4 months ago. Called himself Vernon Ashford then, but that is a name he borrowed off a gravestone in Kansas. He ate at this counter. He bought coffee on credit. He told the hotel keeper he was a cattle buyer out of Denver. He left town owing money to half the merchants on this street. He never lived in Colorado Springs. There is no mercantile. There is no house. There is no future waiting. I am more sorry than I know how to say. Adeline did not fall down in the store. She thanked them in a voice she did not recognize as her own. She walked out into the afternoon sun and stood in the middle of the dusty main street, and for a long moment the town and the mountains and the whole wide Colorado sky simply stopped making sense. She could not go back to Boston. The room at Mrs. Henley's was gone. The dress shop was gone. Her mother and father were in the ground. There was nothing there. And she could not stay here with $17 in a town where every person who walked past her was a stranger. So she decided to walk to Colorado Springs. It was the kind of decision a person makes when the grief has stopped up her ears and she cannot hear reason anymore. She bought half a loaf of bread and a tin cup from Alden Hollister for 30 cents, and she walked out of Copper Ridge, heading in the direction she thought was south. Except that the road she took was not the road to Colorado Springs. It was the old pine road that climbed up into the mountain above the town. It climbed, and by the time Adeline Thorncroft understood she had been walking the wrong way for 2 hours, she was already a long way from any help at all. And that was when her boots gave out on a pine root and $17 rolled across the forest floor, and 3 mountain men on 3 horses came down through the dusk to find her. Silas Hale lifted her to her feet as gentle as if she had been made of glass. The big one, Caleb, did not dismount. He watched her the way a man watches a deer he does not want to spook. The middle brother, Wyatt, swung down at last and gathered the $17 out of the pine needles without a word, piece by piece, and pressed them back into her hand. "We cannot leave her out here, Caleb," Silas said. "She is half frozen already." Caleb Hale was quiet another long moment. Then he turned in his saddle and looked up the dark road toward Elk Hollow, and he looked down the dark road toward the town, and Adeline understood with a small, clear certainty that whatever he decided right now was the thing that would happen. "Up the mountain," he said. "Silas, let her ride double with you as far as the creek crossing. After that, she rides with me. I will not have her bouncing loose on these switchbacks in her condition. Wyatt, you take point. I want eyes on the trail." Wyatt nodded once and turned his horse. Caleb Hale finally looked directly at Adeline, and when he spoke, his voice was no louder than it had been before, but it carried the weight of a promise being made for the first time. "Miss Thorncroft, you are in no danger from any of us. That is the first thing I want you to know. The second thing is that you do not owe us a single word of explanation between here and my kitchen table. We will get you warm. We will feed you, and tomorrow's a long way from tonight." She opened her mouth to thank him and found that the words would not come out, so she nodded. And Silas Hale lifted her up into his saddle and swung up behind her and they started up the mountain into the gathering dark. She did not remember the last 3 miles of that ride. She remembered only flashes. The sound of the creek below the trail, a pair of owls calling to each other through the pine, Silas Hale's steady heartbeat against her back through his coat. The moment at the creek crossing when Caleb rode up alongside and without asking, reached across and lifted her from one saddle to the other as easily as a man lifts a child, and then she was tucked against his chest and the smell of him was wood smoke and leather, and something clean she could not name, and her head found the hollow of his shoulder without her telling it to. She woke in a room she had never seen before. The ceiling overhead was rough pine planks stained dark with age and smoke. A single lamp burned low on a washstand beside the bed. The quilt over her was hand-stitched wedding ring pattern, blue and white, and cream worn soft by years of use. Somebody had taken off her ruined boots and set them neatly by the door. Somebody had spread her damp traveling dress over the back of a chair to drain. Somebody had loosened her hair and brushed it out and laid it across the pillow in a long, honey-colored wave. Adeline lay very still and listened. From downstairs came the sound of a fire and the quiet murmur of men's voices. And then, clearer than any of it, the sound of a harmonica playing a slow hymn tune she remembered from her mother's funeral. The music was not sad exactly. It was only honest the way a man's hands are honest when he has been using them his whole life. She slipped out of the bed in her stocking feet and crept to the top of the narrow staircase and sat down on the third step so the floor would not creak. Through the balusters, she could see the main room of the house below. A stone fireplace wide enough to roast a calf in, an elk head mounted on the chimney wall, long rifles on pegs, a trestle table big enough to seat 10 men, 3 pairs of boots drying by the hearth, and 3 brothers sitting around the fire in the golden light. Silas was the one with the harmonica. He was leaning back in a cane chair with his boots up on the hearthstones, eyes closed, the music running out of him, the way water runs out of a good spring. Wyatt sat at the table with a whetstone and a hunting knife, drawing the blade along the stone in slow, patient passes. He had not taken off his buckskin coat. Firelight caught in his tangled, blonde hair and turned it the color of old brass. And Caleb stood with one hand on the mantel, staring down into the fire, the way a man stares into a fire when he is trying to settle something inside himself that will not quite be settled. His shoulders filled the whole width of the hearth. Silas stopped playing. The cabin went quiet except for the popping of the pine logs. "She is going to wake up soon," Silas said without opening his eyes. "And when she does, we are going to have to tell her the only thing we can tell her, which is that there is nowhere else for her to go tonight. She will want to leave in the morning," Wyatt said, his voice low and even. "That is her right. I just want her to have the strength to do it, if that is what she chooses." "We do not make the choice for her," Caleb said. "We do not make it for her tonight, and we do not make it for her in the morning, and we do not make it for her come spring. She chooses. That is the only way this house works. That is how Ma lived, and that is how she stays too, if she stays at all." Adeline sat very still on the stair in the dark. "Caleb," Silas said quietly, "you know what I am going to say." "I know what you are going to say." "Then say it with me." "I saw her too," Caleb said. The words came slow, as if each one cost him something. "I saw her when I leaned down from the saddle up on the pine road. I do not know what it was I saw. I just know I saw it. And I have not said yes to a thing like that in 5 years since Cora Whitfield lay down in the Denver snow and did not get up again. I did not think I had a yes left in me." "You have one," Silas said. "I saw it in your face up on that road." Wyatt set down the whetstone. He had still not raised his voice above the level of a man who does not need to raise it. "She is not a yes or a no to be said over a woman's head while she sleeps upstairs. She is a person with her own fear and her own grief and her own reasons. We do not decide about her tonight. We decide how to keep her safe tonight, and we leave the rest of it to her and to the Lord, into a good long winter. Caleb nodded slowly. A good long winter, he said. She has until the spring to decide anything. And until then, this house is her house, whether she ever knows it or not. A man keeps his word, brothers. We keep it on this one together. The three of them were silent for a long moment while the fire worked on the pine logs. And on the stairs in the dark, Adeline Thorncroft pressed her palm against her mouth because something inside her rib cage had come loose that she had not known was bolted down. She crept back to the bedroom on her stocking feet. She climbed under the wedding ring quilt. And for the first time since a Tuesday in July, when a sign came down on Washington Street in Boston, Adeline Thorncroft let herself cry without being afraid of who would hear her. She cried quietly and cleanly, and then she slept, and in her sleep she did not dream of Vernon Ashford at all. Morning came with the smell of coffee and bacon and the faint sweet smoke of pine kindling. Adeline woke with a sore ankle and a clear head, and the strange, steadying knowledge that she had not imagined the night before. Somebody had left a tin pitcher of hot water outside her door in a folded clean shirt that was too big for her, but would do for a robe until her dress was warm again. She washed her face, she combed her hair, she put on her half-dry traveling dress and her ruined boots and went downstairs to face the men who had carried her off a mountain in the dark. Silas was at the stove. He turned when she came down, and his grin was the first true kindness she had seen at close range in a year. There she is. Miss Thorncroft, I trust you slept. Coffee is hot, bacon is nearly done, and there is a stool right there by the fire if your feet are still cold. Wyatt was at the table cleaning a rifle barrel. He looked up at her once with his green eyes and nodded a greeting and went back to his work. That was his way of welcoming her. She understood it already. Caleb came in through the back door with an armload of split wood. He stopped when he saw her, and for a small, strange moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then he set the wood in the box by the hearth and took off his hat and hung it on the peg, and he gestured toward the stool by the fire the way a man gestures to a pew in his own church. Miss Thorncroft, sit, eat. There is no conversation that has to happen before you have coffee in your hands. She sat. Silas put a tin cup of black coffee in her hands and a plate of bacon and pan bread on her knee. She ate it with the slow carefulness of a person who has forgotten that eating can be a good thing. The three brothers left her alone with her food. They worked quietly around her, feeding the fire, checking the stove, talking about a fence line that needed mending before the first snow. They let the silence do the work of putting her back together. When she was finished, Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her on a wooden stool of his own. He did not touch his coffee. He just held it between his big weathered hands and looked at her, and then he started talking. Miss Thorncroft, our family has a trade of sorts to put to you. I will lay it out plain, and you can turn it down flat, and no man in this house will hold it against you. Is that understood? She nodded. There is a woman up the valley named Ingrid Voss. She is marrying a neighbor's boy in 3 weeks. She needs a wedding dress, and there is no dressmaker in Copper Ridge since the last one left 2 winters back. There is also a woman down in the town named Prudence Vaughn, married to the man who owns the mine, who has been asking after a real seamstress for nearly a year. There is mending in every cabin within 20 miles of this one that nobody has the skill to do right. Silas tells me you saw your own silver thimble last night, and it is a working thimble, not a keepsake. He tells me your hands are a seamstress's hands. Adeline looked down at her hands. They were. They had always been. Here is what I am offering, Caleb said. You take the upstairs room. That room was my mother's. Nobody has slept in it in 10 years. You sleep there through the winter. You sew the dresses that need sewing in this valley, and you keep whatever coin they pay you. We feed you out of the same pot we feed ourselves out of. Wyatt will bring in the meat. Silas will keep the stove lit. I will see to the stock and the roof. When the Pine Road opens in the spring, if you want to leave, you leave with a full purse and a good horse under you, and you ride to Denver or back to Boston or anywhere else on God's earth that suits you, and we will not say a word to keep you. If you want to stay past the spring, we will talk then about what staying might look like. But not a word of that tonight, not tomorrow, not a single day before you are ready." He paused, his voice dropped even lower. "I asked nothing from you. I will ask nothing from you. A man keeps his word, Miss Thorncroft, and I am telling you now, so you can hold me to it later. You are safe in this house. That is not a favor. That is a fact." The fire popped. Silas had stopped pretending to wipe the stove and was standing perfectly still with the dish rag in his hand. Wyatt had laid the rifle down on the table. Both of them were looking at their older brother, the way men look at a man who has just said out loud something they had been waiting to hear him say. Adeline Thorncroft looked down at her tin cup. She looked at her own hands around it. She thought about Boston and Mrs. Henley's tin box and the $75 that was as good as gone, whether she knew it yet or not. She thought about Vernon Ashford and the white picket fence that did not exist. She thought about $17 rolling across the pine needles. Then she looked up at Caleb Hale, and she answered him with the only answer she had left in her. "Mr. Hale, I accept." Caleb Hale did not smile. Caleb Hale was not a man who smiled easily, but something in his amber eyes changed in a way she would remember for the rest of her life. And what he said next was the sentence that would become, in the years to come, the truest sentence anyone had ever spoken to her. "You are home now, Addie." The word Addie landed in the room like a small, clean bell being rung. Nobody had called her Addie since her mother died. She had to turn her face to the fire so that none of them would see what that single word had done to her. That afternoon, they took her around the place. Silas showed her his forge and his workshop, where he was carving a fiddle out of mountain spruce, running his thumb along the grain, the way a man runs his thumb along something he loves. Wyatt took her to the smokehouse and the root cellar and showed her the stores laid in for the winter strings of dried peppers and crocks of pickled beans and hams dark with smoke. Caleb walked her out to the pole corral where a red milk cow stood heavy with calf, and he laid his big hand on the cow's neck and said her name was Esther, and she had been his mother's favorite, and she was carrying her fourth calf now, and the calf would come before Thanksgiving. At the top of a short rise behind the cabin, Caleb stopped and let her look out across the valley. The aspens were still holding their last gold. The mountains rolled away west and south into a distance that did not seem to have an end. The sky was the high, cold blue of Colorado in late October, the kind of blue that goes on until you cannot believe in it anymore. "This mountain does not care about people, Miss Thorncroft," Caleb said quietly beside her. "It never has, and it never will. It is a hard country. But sometimes, once in a long while, the mountain picks somebody. I do not know how it does it. I just know it does. And I think the mountain picked you last night on that pine road." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the valley. "This mountain chose you." Adeline Thorncroft stood beside him on the rise and did not answer because she did not have an answer yet. But something inside her rib cage that had been cold for 3 years was beginning very slowly to warm. Far below them in the valley in the little town of Copper Ridge, a man in a black coat was walking out of the Western Union office with a yellow telegraph slip folded into his inner pocket. He had high cheekbones and a short beard trimmed close, and his eyes moved across the main street with the flat patience of a man whose trade is watching other people without being watched himself. His name was Cassius Crowe. He had ridden into Copper Ridge on the afternoon train 2 days before, asking quiet questions at the hotel in the depot about a blonde woman traveling alone from Boston. He had found out that she had gotten off the eastbound and had not gotten on the westbound and had not checked into any boarding house in town, and then he had lost her trail altogether at the general store belonging to a man named Hollister. That was a problem. Cassius Crowe did not lose trails. He stepped into the alley beside the telegraph office and unfolded the yellow slip and read the message he had just sent by his own hand, as if reading it again would tell him what to do next. It was addressed to an attorney in Tucson territory. It said only "Subject vanished at Copper Ridge. Request guidance. Crowe." He folded the slip, struck a match, and burned the paper against the alley wall until nothing was left but a black curl on the ground. Then Cassius Crow walked back out onto the main street of Copper Ridge and turned his face toward the mountain road that climbed up into the pines. And he stood there a long time studying the dark line of it against the failing light. Somebody had taken her up that road. He was sure of it now. And wherever she had gone, he had 3 days, maybe 4, before the man he worked for would expect an answer about what to do with her. High above him on the rise behind Elk Hollow Homestead, Adeline Thorncroft was turning away from the valley to follow Caleb Hale back to the cabin for supper. She did not know yet that a man in a black coat was standing in a street below her, with the wind in his face and murder already half decided behind his eyes. She did not know yet that the winter coming down out of the high country was going to test her and everyone in that cabin in ways she could not have dreamed. She did not know yet that a woman named Della Ashworth was about to step off a stagecoach with the same dead name and the same broken letters in her bag. She did not know any of it. All she knew as she walked back down the rise beside the biggest, quietest man she had ever stood next to was that for the first time since a Tuesday in July when the sign came down on Washington Street, she was no longer carrying her grief entirely alone. The wind shifted out of the north as they reached the cabin door. Caleb stopped on the porch and looked up at the sky and frowned. "Weather is coming," he said softly. "Sooner than I thought." Wyatt stepped out of the barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder and looked up at the same sky and nodded once in silent agreement. Inside, Silas had already lit the lamps against the early dusk. The cabin glowed warm and gold through the windows. Adeline Thorncroft crossed the threshold into that light, with the tin cup she had carried all afternoon still clasped between her hands. And as the door closed behind her, she understood 2 things at once with a clarity that frightened her. The first was that she was not going to leave this mountain in the spring. The second was that something very dark is riding up the pine road behind her, and it was going to get here before the first snow. The first snow came down on Elk Hollow Homestead on the 4th morning of November, and it came down the way the weather comes down in the high country when the mountain has finally made up its mind about the season. It came quiet. It came thick. And by the time Adeline Thorncroft stepped out onto the front porch with a tin cup of hot coffee in her hands, the whole world from the porch rail to the dark wall of the pines had been wiped clean and written over in white. She stood there a long time breathing an air so cold and clean it hurt her throat, and she thought about how the snow in Boston had always been gray before it ever touched the ground. The snow out here was a different animal altogether. Behind her, the cabin door opened, and Caleb Hale stepped out with his heavy sheepskin coat half buttoned and his hat in his hand. He did not say anything at first. He just stood beside her on the porch and looked out at the same white country she was looking at, and the silence between them was the kind of silence 2 people can only share after they have already stopped being strangers. "Winter always ends, Miss Thorncroft," he said at last, very quietly. "You hold on to that when the cold gets deep. It does not feel like it come January, but it does. Winter always ends." He set his hat on his head and walked out into the snow to see to the stock, and Adeline stood on the porch watching his tall, steady back moving away from her across the white, and she said the words softly to herself, tasting them the way a woman tastes a promise. Winter always ends. Those first 2 weeks at Elk Hollow taught her more about living than 22 years in Boston ever had. Silas showed her how to bank a stove fire so it would hold through the night without smoking the cabin out. Wyatt showed her how to read the sky for the second storm behind the first. Caleb walked her out to the pole corral every morning at dawn and taught her the names of the cattle, one by one the bull named Jericho, who was the color of old blood, the red milk cow Esther, heavy with her late calf, the 2 yearling steers Silas had been feeding by hand since their mothers had rejected them. In the afternoon, she sewed. She set up her small working table in the corner of the main room nearest the window, where the light was best, and she laid out the cream silk she had bought on credit from Alden Hollister for Ingrid Voss's wedding dress. Silas built her a folding stand for her bolts of cloth out of pine scraps from his workshop, and when he brought it to her, she saw that he had carved a tiny cornflower into one of the legs. He grinned like a boy caught leaving a note on a schoolhouse desk and said, "I could not help myself, Miss Thorncroft. They just look like your eyes." She did not know what to say to that, so she said thank you, and she set her new silver thimble on the stand where she could see it every time she looked up from her work. The new thimble was Silas's doing too. He had hammered it out of a small ingot of silver in his forge on the second day she was in the house, and he had etched a single cornflower around the rim, and he had set it beside her coffee cup one morning without a word of explanation. "Your old thimble has miles on it," was all he said when she picked it up. "This one is to start the next batch of miles with." Wyatt's gifts were different. Wyatt's gifts were never wrapped in anything. On her fifth morning at Elk Hollow, Adeline came down to breakfast and found a single dried cornflower lying across the top page of her sewing notebook. She looked up. Wyatt was at the table cleaning his rifle, and he did not look at her, and he did not say anything, and she understood that this was his way of leaving a word where a word could not be spoken. She pressed the cornflower between the pages of her mother's Bible, and she did not mention it, and the next morning there was a small sprig of juniper on the same notebook, and she pressed that too. Caleb did not leave her cornflowers. Caleb left her coffee. Every morning before the sun was fully up, Adeline would come downstairs and there would be a tin cup of black coffee still steaming, set carefully on the stool beside her work table. He was never in the room when she came down. He was always already out with the stock. But the coffee was there every morning without fail for 14 straight mornings. And on the 15th morning, she realized that she had started listening for the soft sound of his boots in the kitchen before dawn, the way a woman listens for a voice she is learning to love. She was learning. She was learning them one by one, and they were learning her. The first real conversation happened on a Sunday night by the fire after the supper plates had been cleared, and Silas had pulled out his harmonica and played through two old hymns and then set the harmonica down on his knee because the mood in the room had turned towards something quieter than music. Wyatt was mending a strap on a snowshoe. Caleb was cleaning his pipe. And Adeline, with her feet tucked under her on the cane chair that had already become hers without anybody declaring it, finally told them about her mother and father. She told them about the scarlet fever and how it had come through the tenement in the same week and taken them, both her father first and her mother 3 days later. She told them about leaving the girls' school on Beacon Hill with her books still in her desk. She told them about Mrs. Henderson's dress shop on Washington Street and the 4 years she had worked there and the morning the sign came down. And she told them about the letters from a man who did not exist and the wedding dress she had sewn by candlelight for a wedding that was never going to happen. She did not cry while she told it. She was past crying about any of it by now. She just told it the way a person tells a thing she is finally ready to set down. When she was finished, the fire popped, and Caleb took the pipe from his mouth and looked at her across the hearth with his amber eyes gone very soft. "Miss Thorncroft," he said, "my mother used to say that grief is a kind of country and that the people who have been through it recognize each other without having to ask for papers at the border. I think maybe you have been walking in that country a long time by yourself. I just want you to know that you are not walking in it by yourself anymore." Wyatt did not look up from the snowshoe strap, but his hands went still for a moment, and then he said without looking at her, "My father went in the spring of '68. Our mother went with him in the same slide. Silas was 17 years old. I was 19. Caleb was 21. We know that country too. Silas, who almost never let a silence get heavy, did not try to lift this one. He just reached across the space between the chairs and rested his warm hand briefly on the back of Adeline's wrist. And then he took it back, and then he picked up his harmonica and played a slow old tune called Shenandoah. And Adeline Thorncroft sat very still in the firelight, with her tears running quiet down her face, and felt for the first time in a long time the particular kind of peace that only comes to a person who has stopped being alone in her sadness. The storm hit on a Tuesday. Caleb had seen it coming the day before in the way the aspens were standing and the way the elk were moving down out of the high meadows, and he had sent Wyatt out before dawn to push the cattle in closer to the barns. By mid-morning, the sky had gone the color of slate, and the wind was coming hard out of the north. By noon, the first flakes were coming in sideways. By 2 o'clock, Adeline could not see the woodpile from the kitchen window. Caleb and Wyatt were still out. Silas paced the cabin with the patience of a younger brother who has been left to hold the house and does not quite trust himself with the job. Every 10 minutes he went to the window and wiped the frost off the glass with the heel of his hand and stared out into the white and saw nothing. Every 10 minutes he came back and added another piece of pine to the fire. At 3:15, Adeline Thorncroft made up her mind. "Silas, get me a coat. Get me your father's old coat, the long buffalo one. I am going out with you." Silas stared at her. "Miss Thorncroft, you cannot. You do not know the ground out there. You will go down in a drift and we will lose you." "Silas, your brothers are out there and the light is failing, and there is no more time to argue about who is and who is not going. Get me the coat." She had never given a man an order in her life. She had never raised her voice in a house in her life. She did it now, and it came out clean and steady, and Silas Hale looked at her for 3 seconds, the way a man looks at someone he is revising his whole estimate of. Then he went to the peg by the door and took down the long buffalo coat that had belonged to Jeremiah Hale Sr., and he held it out to her without another word. They went out into the storm together, roped at the waist with 20 feet of rawhide between them so that neither one of them could be lost. The world had been erased. There was only the wind and the white and the occasional dark shape of a fence post or a pine trunk coming at her out of the blur. Silas broke trail in front of her, shouting his brother's names into the wind, and the wind just took the names and tore them to pieces. They found Wyatt first. He was half a mile out, dragging himself along the top of the pasture fence with one arm because a cow had gone down in a drift, and he had gone into the drift after shearer, and she had kicked him in the ribs on the way out. His right hand was whitey with frostbite inside his glove, and his mouth was cut, and his eyes were slits against the wind. But he was walking. He was even trying to swear. "Where is Caleb?" Silas shouted. "West Gate," Wyatt rasped. 10 head bunched against the windbreak. He was still on his feet the last time I saw him, but Silas, the old bull Jericho, went down on him. I saw the bull fall on his leg. I could not get back to him. I had to get the cow out of the drift. I had to. "Silas, you have to get me to Caleb." They got Wyatt on his feet between them, and they pushed on into the wind. The rope cut into Adeline's waist through the buffalo coat. Her face was going numb. Her skirt was frozen stiff below the knee. She did not remember being this cold even in the worst January in Boston. She did not care. She only cared about the name Caleb and the picture in her head of a man pinned under the weight of an old bull in a drifting snow. They found him at the west gate. Jericho was gone, herded off at last toward the windbreak with the other cattle. But Caleb Hale was sitting in the snow with his back against the gate post, and his right leg stretched out at an angle a leg is not supposed to make, and his face under the brim of his hat was the color of old ash. When he saw the three of them come out of the white, he did not smile, but something lifted behind his eyes that was very close to a smile. "I told you," he said hoarsely. "I told you the mountain picks people. I knew it would pick you up this fence line before the night was out." "Hush," Adeline said, and she dropped to her knees in the snow beside him, and she took his big, cold, shaking hand in both of hers, and she pressed it against her cheek without thinking about it, and she said it again. "Hush, we are taking you home now, Caleb Hale. You save your words for the kitchen fire." They got him up. It took all three of them. Silas took one side, and Wyatt with his cracked ribs and his frostbitten hand took the other, and Adeline walked behind with her hands braced against the small of Caleb's back to steady him every time he slipped. His right leg dragged. He did not make a single sound of pain the whole half-mile back. Once, when he almost went down in a drift, his hand reached back blind and found hers in the snow, and he held on to her as if she were the only fixed point left in the world. And then he let her go again and made himself keep walking. They got him into the cabin at the last blue edge of daylight. The kitchen was like walking into the inside of a lantern. Silas got the stove roaring. Wyatt, even with his ribs cracked, went straight to the cupboard for the whiskey and the clean linen and the little leather roll of splints he kept for emergencies. Adeline cut Caleb's boot off his right foot with a kitchen knife because the swelling would not allow the boot to come off any other way. And when she saw the state of his ankle, she had to close her eyes for a moment and steady herself against the table. Dislocated, Wyatt said flatly. Not broken, I do not think, but it has to go back in tonight. It will be worse tomorrow. Then we do it tonight. Miss Thorncroft, you do not have to be the one to do this. I can walk Silas through it. Wyatt, your ribs are cracked and your right hand is half dead. Silas is going to be holding Caleb down. There ain't no one else to do it. Tell me what to do. Wyatt looked at her a long moment through his pain. Then he nodded. Black Elk taught me this one summer when I was a boy, a Shoshone grandfather who lived in the next valley. He put my own shoulder back in when I was 14. I will tell you every move. You will do it clean. Put your hands where I tell you to put them, push when I tell you to push, and do not stop for the sound he is going to make. Adeline nodded once. Her hands were very steady. She did not know where the steadiness was coming from. She only knew that it was in her the way certain things turn out to be in a person only when the moment comes. Silas took Caleb by the shoulders. Wyatt talked her through the grip. Adeline set her palms where Wyatt told her to set them, and when Wyatt said now, she pushed the way he had told her to push, and Caleb Hale made a single rough sound that she would hear for the rest of her life, and the ankle went back where it belonged, with a small, clean sound like a door latch closing. Caleb sagged back against Silas. His face was wet, so was hers. She realized distantly that she had been crying for some time without being aware of it. Good, Wyatt breathed. Good. Splint it now. Wrap it tight. He will sleep tonight. He will walk with a stick in a week. He will walk right in a month. Adeline Thorncroft, you did clean work. My grandfather, Black Elk, would have been proud of you. She did not remember most of the next hour. She remembered splinting the ankle with Wyatt's quiet instructions in her ear. She remembered helping Silas get Caleb onto the narrow bed in the downstairs room off the kitchen that had been Jeremiah Hale's bed when he was alive. She remembered Wyatt letting her wrap his own ribs at last in silence, while Silas took off the frozen buffalo coat that had been her armor and hung it over a chair to drip by the stove. She remembered sitting down on the cane chair by Caleb's bed, with a cup of coffee in her hands that she did not remember being given, and she remembered that his big, weathered hand was lying open on top of the quilt, and without thinking about it at all, she put her hand in his eyes open. They were glassy with pain and whiskey, but they found her. Addie, I am here. You pulled me out of the snow. Silas and Wyatt pulled you out of the snow. I just walked behind you and prayed. No, you pulled me out of the snow. You pulled me out of something else too. I will tell you what when I can find the words for it. He closed his eyes then and slept, but his hands stayed closed around hers, and Adeline Thorncroft sat in the cane chair beside his bed all night and did not move and did not let go. Not once. Not even when the fire in the stove burned down to embers and Silas came in and quietly built it up again without saying a word to either of them. The storm blew itself out the next day, and Copper Ridge dug itself out, and life went on at Elk Hollow with Caleb Hale on a cane and Wyatt Hale wrapped in linen and Adeline Thorncroft sewing in the corner by the window through the long gray afternoons of early winter. Ingrid Voss's wedding dress was finished on time and delivered to the Voss cabin with Silas driving the sleigh, and 2 weeks later, Ingrid sent down a basket of preserves and a little handwritten note that said, Miss Thorncroft, the dress was the most beautiful thing any girl in this valley has ever worn, and everybody at the wedding wants to know your name. After that, the work came steady. Prudence Vaughn sent a note from the big house in town asking for 2 Sunday dresses of watered silk. Mrs. Kellerman wanted a morning dress for her sister in Denver. Mrs. Faulkner, whose husband taught the one-room school, needed 3 practical work dresses in plain calico. The widow, Mrs. Bramwell, wanted a wool coat. By the first week of December, Adeline had more orders than she could finish before Christmas, and she was paying her own way in the house for the first time, and Caleb Hale, watching her from his cane by the hearth, had begun to look at her the way a man looks at the answer to a prayer he never quite got around to saying out loud. And then on the second Wednesday of December, Silas came back from a supply run to Copper Ridge with something in the bed of the wagon that changed the temperature of the whole house. Silas had gone down to town for coffee and sugar and bolts of cloth for Adeline's backlog of orders. He was supposed to be gone the whole day. He came back at 3 in the afternoon with his jaw set in a way that Adeline had never seen on his usually easy face. And when he pulled the wagon into the yard, she could see that there was a second person wrapped in a blanket on the seat beside him, a young woman with her face buried in her hands and her shoulders shaking. Adeline came out onto the porch without her coat. "Silas, who is that?" "Addie, I need you to come down here real slow and real kind. This is Miss Della Ashworth. She got off the stagecoach in Copper Ridge 2 hours ago with $3 in her pocket and a letter in her bag." "Addie, it is the same letter. It is his handwriting. It is the same man." Adeline came down the porch steps into the snow in her house shoes. Della Ashworth lifted her face out of her hands. She was 20 years old, maybe, with pale brown hair coming loose from a traveling braid, and a small nose red from crying, and eyes so exhausted they were barely focused. She looked at Adeline, and Adeline looked at her, and neither one of them needed another word to know exactly what the other one had been through. "He told me his name was Vernon Ashford," Della whispered. "He told me he owned a hotel in Tucson. I rode the train for 6 days. There was no hotel. There was no man." A kind woman at the Tucson depot said there had been another woman a while back, somebody up in Colorado territory who had been through the same thing and had not gone home. She said, "Maybe if I could get to Copper Ridge, maybe the same people who had helped the other girl might help me. Please, I have nowhere else. I have nothing else." Adeline took Della Ashworth in her arms right there in the snow in the dooryard of Elk Hollow Homestead, and she held her while Della shook. And over Della's shoulder, she looked up at Silas Hale, who was still standing on the wagon seat, and she did not have to say anything because Silas was already nodding. "Bring her inside," Silas said. "Bring her inside, and we will feed her, and we will warm her, and then we will decide what to do, Addie." "I already decided what I think. I think she stays. There is room at the top of the stairs for another bed. I can build it tomorrow. Caleb will say the same thing the moment he sees her. You watch." Caleb did say the same thing. He said it from his cane by the hearth the moment they came through the door without needing the situation explained to him. He said, "Miss Ashworth, welcome to Elk Hollow. You are safe in this house. A man keeps his word, and so does his whole family, and you are under my roof now." And Della Ashworth started to cry all over again in a new different way, the way a person cries when she has finally put down a thing she did not know she could stop carrying. That night, after Della had been fed and bathed and put to bed in the narrow cot Silas dragged up from the storeroom, Adeline sat with Caleb by the fire. His bad leg was stretched out on a footstool. The cane was leaning against the stones. The cabin was quiet in the particular way cabins go quiet after a new soul has been added to them, and everybody has agreed without saying so that the walls have to stretch a little to hold her. Adeline finally asked the question that had been building in her for weeks. "Caleb, there is something about your family that I do not fully understand yet. Something Silas almost said on the second day I was here and then stopped himself. Something in the way you 3 talk to each other about me when you think I am asleep upstairs. I am not asking you to explain everything tonight. I am only asking you to tell me if there is a thing I ought to know before the winter goes any deeper." Caleb Hale looked at the fire for a long time before he answered. There is a thing, he said at last. It comes out of the old country, out of the deep hollers of Tennessee, where my father was raised. Land was scarce up there, and women were scarcer, and sometimes once in a while, when brothers loved each other more than they loved the idea of splitting a farm in half, they would agree together to build a life around one good woman instead of each of them going off to chase a smaller life alone. My father's two brothers were killed in the war before they could ever stand up in that kind of arrangement with him. But my mother knew the tradition. She honored it. She raised us on stories of it. She told us that if we ever, any of us, found a woman, we all three could love honestly and equally, and without one of us trying to push the other two out of the way, then that was what our family was built for, and our father's land was built for, and our mother's house was built to hold. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking into the fire. Addie, I am not asking you for anything tonight. I am not asking you for anything tomorrow. I am not asking you for anything at all until you have had a whole winter to get your breath back and know your own mind. I am telling you this only because you deserve to know what house you are sitting in. That is all. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was moving in the pines. Adeline Thorncroft did not answer him right away. She was thinking about Boston and the narrow rules of the boarding house on Chestnut Street, and the way Mrs. Henderson used to say that a proper Christian girl knew her place. She was thinking about a white picket fence that did not exist. She was thinking about Silas leaving cornflowers on her sewing table and Wyatt walking beside her in the pine woods without needing to fill the silence with talk, and Caleb's hand closing around hers in a fence-line drift when he thought he was going to die. She was thinking about the word home and how that word had meant a thing in Boston and was beginning to mean a very different thing up here. Caleb, she said quietly, I heard you. That was all she said, and Caleb Hale nodded once slowly as if that was more than he had expected and exactly what he had needed, and he did not ask her for anything else that night. The letters came on the 17th of January. Silas Burlow, them marked from the Copper Ridge post office, along with a sack of flour and a bundle of newspapers. There were two of them for Adeline. The first was in the spidery handwriting of old Mrs. Henley in Boston. The second was in a crisp lawyer's hand on heavy cream paper from an office in Denver. Adeline sat down at the kitchen table and opened the Henley letter first, and when she read it through, she went very still and laid the letter face down on the table and put her hands flat on top of it as if she were holding it down to keep it from flying away. Addie, Silas said carefully, what is it? Mrs. Henley's building in Boston was sold in November. The new owner had the storage rooms cleared out. My $75 was in a tin box in her closet. It is gone, all of it. She says she tried to stop them. She says she is old and she could not. She says she is praying for me. Adeline's voice did not break. Her voice had gone past breaking. It was the last thing I had in this world that was mine from my old life. It is gone. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb Hale, standing by the hearth on his cane, said in a voice as quiet as falling snow, Addie, open the other one. She opened the other one. It was from a federal attorney in Denver by the name of Ambrose Beckett. The letter was 4 paragraphs long, and it was written in the flat, careful language of a man who has written too many letters like it. It said that a man named Quintus Hargrove, lately using the alias Vernon Ashford among other names, had been arrested in Tucson in the last week of November and was being held in the federal jail in Denver, awaiting trial on charges of mail fraud and interstate theft. It said that more than 40 women in 6 territories had been identified as victims of Mr. Hargrove's correspondence scheme. It said that the prosecution was building a case that would put Mr. Hargrove in federal prison for a very long time. It said that Miss Adeline Thorncroft's testimony was being formally requested, that the government would cover her travel and lodging, and that the trial would begin in Denver on the 23rd day of February in the year of our Lord, 1879. Adeline laid the second letter down on top of the first. Her hands were shaking now. Not with grief, with something harder. Caleb stepped away from the hearth. His cane tapped twice on the plank floor. He came to the table and laid one big hand flat on the back of her chair. Addie, he said, you are not going to Denver alone. Caleb, you have a broken ankle. Wyatt has cracked ribs that are barely healed. Silas is the only one of you who can even sit a horse properly right now, and you cannot leave the stock for a week in January. Addie, you are not going to Denver alone. Obadiah Tomlin has 2 grown sons who have been asking for work all winter. I will pay them to keep the stock. Wyatt's ribs are good enough. My ankle is good enough. Silas will drive the sleigh. That man is not going to look at you across a courtroom in Denver without seeing 3 Hale brothers standing at the back of the room behind you, and that is the end of the discussion, and I do not want to hear another word against it. Adeline Thorncroft looked up at him, and whatever she had been about to argue, she did not argue. She put her face in her hands instead, and she let herself cry for the second time since she had walked into this house, and this time she was not crying because she had lost anything. She was crying because after 22 years of carrying everything by herself, somebody had finally said the words, "You are not going alone." That night, long after the others had gone to bed, Wyatt Hale came out of his room and walked quietly to the porch in his stocking feet and found Adeline sitting on the top step of the porch wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the January stars over the dark mountain. He sat down beside her without asking. He did not speak for a while. He just watched the stars with her. Then in the voice that was so low it was almost not a voice at all, Wyatt Hale said the longest thing he had ever said to her. I am not the one who is going to tell you in pretty words what we all feel, Addie. Silas is better at pretty. Caleb is better at steady. What I am good at is watching. I was watching you the first minute we rode up on that pine road in October, and I have been watching you every day since, and I want you to know this one thing before we go down the mountain to Denver. I knew the first minute, I knew when I slid off my horse and saw your face in the pine needles. Whatever this house is going to be when spring comes, I knew that morning what you were going to mean in it. I do not say that to put weight on you tonight. I say it so that when you stand up in that courtroom in Denver and he looks at you, you will know there is a man on the back wall who has known the truth about you since before he knew your name. He reached out very slowly and put one warm, rough hand against the side of her face for the length of a heartbeat, and then he took it away. This mountain chose you, Addie. I am just one of the 3 men it chose you for. Then he got up and went back inside and left her alone with the stars. Far below them in the dark of the Copper Ridge Western Union office, a man in a black coat was sitting at a desk in a back room that was supposed to be closed for the night. Cassius Crowe had made a friend of the night clerk a week ago with a silver dollar and a bottle of rye. And for another silver dollar, the night clerk had started letting him read the outgoing wires before they went out on the line. The wire Crowe was reading tonight was addressed to the federal attorney in Denver, Ambrose Beckett, from Mrs. Hester Whitlock of the Whitlock boarding house in Copper Ridge, and it confirmed that a Miss Adeline Thorncroft of Elk Hollow Homestead would be present in Denver on the 23rd of February to testify against Quintus Hargrove. Cassius Crowe folded the wire back along its original creases and laid it on the desk exactly as he had found it. Then he walked out into the cold January street and stood a long time looking up at the dark shape of the mountain above the town. He had a telegraph of his own to send in the morning. He would not send it from Copper Ridge. He would send it from the next town down the line, where nobody knew his face. It would be addressed to a man in Denver whose profession was settling matters that could not be settled by lawyers. And it would carry only one instruction: handle her before the 23rd. Do not let her reach the witness stand. High above him on the mountain in the warm kitchen of Elk Hollow, the lamp in the window finally went out for the night. Adeline Thorncroft did not know that a man in a black coat was standing in a dark street below her, making a promise to himself about her life. She only knew that in 5 weeks she was going down to Denver and that she was going with 3 men who had already decided without asking her permission that no harm was going to touch her from here to the courthouse door and back again. The wind shifted out of the north. More snow was coming. The mountain, as it always did, was making itself ready for whatever was about to climb up into it next. They came down off the mountain on the morning of the 19th of February in a heavy sleigh behind two big bay horses, with Silas holding the reins and Caleb beside him on the bench, and Wyatt and Adeline and Della wrapped in buffalo robes in the back. The sun was out for the first time in 9 days, and the snow on the pines was so bright it hurt to look at. Nobody spoke much on the ride down to Copper Ridge Station. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said in the long evenings of January by the fire. What was ahead of them now was not a thing words were going to fix. At the station, Silas shook hands with Alden Hollister, who had come down to see them off, and Alden pressed a small parcel of sandwiches into Adeline's hands and told her that every decent soul in Copper Ridge was praying for her. Then the train whistled and they climbed aboard, and the mountain that had held her safe for 4 months began to slide away behind the window of the passenger car, smaller and smaller, until the last dark line of the pines disappeared into the rolling white country, and there was nothing left in front of her but Denver. Wyatt saw the man first. He was sitting 4 rows forward in the same car on the aisle in a black wool coat and a low-brimmed hat. He was reading a newspaper. He had been reading the same newspaper for 20 minutes without ever turning the page. Wyatt watched him for a full 5 minutes without moving his head more than half an inch in the man's direction, and then he leaned across the seat and put his mouth close to Caleb's ear and said 3 words very quietly. 4 rows up. Caleb did not turn his head either. He waited a long moment. Then he let his eyes drift forward, the way a bored passenger's eyes drift forward, and he saw what Wyatt had seen, and he did not let his face change at all. "Crow," Caleb murmured. "Has to be," Wyatt said. "He has been on this train since Copper Ridge. He did not come out of the station house. He was already on board when we got on. He came up out of the next town down the line and doubled back. He is good. But I have been watching Men in the Pines for 20 years, and he is not that good. Addie does not hear about this yet. No, not yet. When we get to Denver, I want you on him the second we get off the train. Do not lose him. I want to know where he sleeps tonight." Wyatt nodded once and went back to looking out the window like a man who had never noticed a soul on the train, but his own people. Denver in February was a loud gray city of smoke and iron and cold mud. Silas and Caleb walked Adeline and Della straight from the platform to the Federal Hotel, where Ambrose Beckett had reserved 2 rooms for them, and they did not stop walking, and they did not look behind them, and Wyatt slipped off the back of the group before they were 10 feet off the platform and was gone. Adeline did not see him go. She only realized he was missing when they reached the hotel lobby, and she turned to say something to him, and he was not there. "Where is Wyatt?" "Seeing to something for me," Caleb said quietly. "He will be along." She looked up at him. She had learned by now how to read his face. What she saw there made her stomach tighten, but she did not ask again. Ambrose Beckett met them in the private parlor of the hotel that evening. He was a tall, spare man in his middle 50s, with gray threaded through his beard and the kind of eyes that had seen too many good people hurt by bad ones. He shook Caleb's hand first, and then Adeline's, and then he sat her down and laid out the case in plain, careful language. Quintus Hargrove had been writing to women across 6 territories for nearly 4 years. The count now stood at 41 identified victims. The total sum stolen came to almost $6,000. 14 of the women had come to Denver to testify. 3 more would arrive by stage tomorrow. The trial would begin in 4 days. Adeline's testimony would be requested on the 2nd day. She would not be asked anything about her private life after her arrival in Copper Ridge. She would be asked only about the letters, the promises, the request for $75, and the moment she had learned the truth from Alden Hollister in the general store. Ambrose Beckett looked her straight in the eye when he said this last part. "Miss Thorncroft, I will not let that defense lawyer turn you into the story. The story is Quintus Hargrove. I will protect you on that stand." Adeline nodded. She did not trust her voice yet. Wyatt came in at full dark, dusting snow off his shoulders, his green eyes calm and hard. He did not say a word until the parlor door was shut behind him. Then he walked over to Caleb and spoke low. Cheap hotel on the south edge of the stockyards. Second floor back room. He met a man there. Short, heavy set, bad teeth, a scar across the back of his right hand. That man is not Crow. That man is the one Crow sent for. They spoke for about 10 minutes. And I could not hear what they said, but I watched the way they shook hands when it was over. That was a handshake of a job agreed to. Caleb's face did not change, but something in his shoulders settled the way a man's shoulders settle when he has stopped hoping for an easier answer and has accepted the harder one. Ambrose, Caleb said quietly, not turning around. We need to speak with the United States Marshal before morning. There is a man in this city who has been paid to stop Miss Thorncroft from reaching the witness stand. Ambrose Beckett was on his feet before Caleb had finished the sentence. They moved Adeline and Della to a different room on a different floor that night at Ambrose Beckett's insistence, and 2 deputy marshals took positions in the hallway outside. But Caleb Hale was not a man who trusted a hallway full of strangers with a woman he had carried off a mountain in the dark. He dragged a straight-backed wooden chair out of his own room and set it down in front of Adeline's door and sat in it with his coat on his lap and his old Colt revolver resting underneath the coat. Adeline opened the door around midnight in her wrapper and found him there. Caleb Hale, you have been awake since 4 o'clock this morning. You cannot sit in that chair all night. I can, and I am going to. Caleb, Addie, there is a man in this city who has been hired to hurt you before the 23rd. I do not know who he is. I do not know where he is. I only know that I am sitting in this chair until the sun comes up and there is nothing you can say to me that is going to move me out of it. A man keeps his word. I told you in my kitchen in October that you were safe in my house. Tonight, this hallway is my house. That is all. She stood in the doorway looking at him for a long moment. The big, quiet man on the wooden chair with his broken ankle still healing and his revolver on his knee and his amber eyes finally, after a whole day of holding it in, letting her see how tired he was. Something inside her that had been holding itself upright for 4 months simply gave way. Caleb, come inside. Addie, I cannot come inside. It would not be proper, and there is no one in this hotel who knows our business. Caleb, I am not asking you to come inside for anything but a chair that does not crucify your back. Come inside. Sit in the armchair by the door. Keep your revolver on your knee if that is what makes you able to breathe. But do not sit out here in that hallway 1 more minute and tear yourself apart. I cannot bear it. Do you hear me? I cannot bear it. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, Caleb Hale did what a woman asked him to do instead of what his own sense of duty told him to do. He stood up, carried the chair inside her room, set it against the wall beside the door, and sat back down in it with the revolver across his knee and the coat over his shoulders. Adeline closed the door behind him and turned the key in the lock. Then she went back to the bed and lay down on top of the covers in her wrapper, in her thick wool stockings, and for a long time neither one of them spoke. Addie, he said finally from the chair in the dark. Yes, Caleb. I have not been this afraid since the spring my mother and father went into the snow. I just wanted you to know that. I do not want to pretend I am not afraid. Not to you. She did not answer him for a moment. Then she said in a voice no louder than the sound of the gaslight hissing out in the street below, I am not afraid anymore, Caleb. I was afraid in that pine forest in October. I was afraid when I read the letter from Mrs. Henley. I have not been afraid since we stepped onto the train this morning. Do you know why? Why, Addie? Because you are in the room. Caleb Hale did not answer her. He did not need to. He sat the chair all night with his revolver on his knee, and Adeline Thorncroft slept the first deep, untroubled sleep she had slept since July. The morning of the trial was cold and blue and still. The federal courtroom in Denver was packed to the walls. Adeline sat in the front row in a dark navy dress she had made herself with her hair pinned up simply and her mother's Bible in her lap, and the new silver thimble that Silas had forged for her tucked into the pocket of her dress like a small, silent prayer. Caleb sat on her right. Silas sat on her left. Wyatt stood at the back of the courtroom with his back against the rear wall and his green eyes moving slowly across every face in the room, and he did not sit down once the entire morning. Quintus Hargrove was brought in handcuffs. He was thinner than the photograph he had sent to Boston. He was grayer. His eyes moved across the courtroom until they found Adeline, and when they found her, they did not flicker with regret or shame or any human feeling at all. They only calculated the way a card player calculates a hand he is about to lose. Adeline looked back at him, and she did not look away. Lavinia Wells testified first. Then Temperance Matthews, the older woman who had lost $300. Then two women Adeline had never met before. Then Della Ashworth, who had to stop twice to steady her voice, but who got through it. Then just before the noon recess, Ambrose Beckett called Adeline Thorncroft to the stand. She walked to the witness box on legs that were steadier than she had expected them to be. She laid her hand on her mother's Bible and swore to tell the truth, and she sat down and she looked at Ambrose Beckett, and she answered every question he asked her in a clear, calm voice that did not shake once. She told the court about the advertisement in the Boston Herald. She told them about the 6 months of letters and the white picket fence that did not exist, and the parlor with the rosewood piano that did not exist, and the mercantile on Tremont Street that did not exist. She told them about the last letter and the request for $75. She told them about the small, unnamed thing inside her that had stopped her from mailing the money, and about Mrs. Henley holding it in a tin box under her bed. She told them about missing the train at Copper Ridge Station with $17 in her purse. She told them about Alden Hollister's face when she spoke the name Vernon Ashford in his general store. Ambrose Beckett thanked her and sat down, and then the defense lawyer stood up. He was young and his suit was too new, and his eyes had the bright, unkind gleam of a man who thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. He walked to the witness box and smiled at Adeline the way a snake smiles at a bird. Miss Thorncroft, let us talk for a moment about what happened after you reached Copper Ridge. According to the statements on file, you are currently residing on an isolated mountain homestead with not one but 3 unmarried men. Is that correct? The courtroom shifted. That is correct. And these 3 men have been, shall we say, providing for you for the past 4 months. Room and board, protection, personal escort to this very trial, I believe. Is that correct? That is correct. Miss Thorncroft, is it not possible that your sudden and rather fortunate new living arrangement has made you something other than the pitiable victim my learned colleague has painted for this court? Is it not possible that you have in fact done rather well out of the collapse of your previous plans? Is it not possible that you are no longer a victim at all, but a woman who traded one arrangement for a better one? Ambrose Beckett was on his feet, roaring objection. The judge was banging his gavel. The courtroom was in uproar. Adeline Thorncroft sat very still in the witness box and waited for the room to quiet. When the room was quiet, she turned her face fully toward the defense lawyer, and she spoke in a voice that carried into every corner of that courtroom without ever rising above conversational. Sir, you have asked me a question in front of this court, and I am going to answer it in front of this court, and I am going to answer it once. The judge let her continue. Ambrose Beckett sat down slowly. My private life on the mountain above Copper Ridge is none of your business, and none of this court's business, and I will speak of it only this far. I fell on a pine road in October with $17 in my hand and nowhere on God's earth to go. 3 men rode up out of the dusk and did not ask me what I could give them. They gave me a roof. They gave me food. They gave me a room that had belonged to the mother they had buried in the snow 10 years before. They gave me a whole winter to find my feet again, and they asked nothing in return. Not one thing. I owe them a debt that no court in this country could ever weigh on a scale, and I am not going to sit in this witness box and let you turn the only honest men I have met in my whole life into something ugly so that you can save your client's neck. She turned from the defense lawyer to the judge. Your Honor, your prosecutor asked me here to speak the truth about what Quintus Hargrove did to me. That is all I came to this courtroom to do. I lost my parents to the scarlet fever. I lost my employment to the panic. I lost my last savings to an old woman in Boston who could not stop a greedy man from emptying her cellar. I almost lost my life and my hope along with them because of the letters that man over there put into my hands. That is the story this court needs to hear from me, and that is the only story I am going to tell here today. She turned back to the defense lawyer, and her blue cornflower eyes had gone quiet and cold in a way that was somehow more terrible than any anger. You will not ask me again about the men of Elk Hollow Homestead. Not today, not ever. Are we clear? The defense lawyer was clear. The defense lawyer who had come into this courtroom thinking that a 22-year-old seamstress from Boston was going to be easy prey sat down and did not stand up again until his client was sentenced. The courtroom burst into a low, astonished murmur. The judge rapped his gavel once gently and called the noon recess. Caleb Hale was waiting at the courtroom rail when Adeline stepped down from the witness box. He did not say a word. He just took her hand in both of his and held it for a long moment with his head bowed. And then he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles one time there in front of the whole federal courtroom of Denver, and nobody in that room mistook what they had just seen. Wyatt caught the second man during the noon recess. He had been watching the courtroom entrances since dawn. When a heavy-set man with a scar across the back of his right hand slipped in through the side door in a courthouse clerk's coat that did not quite fit him, Wyatt Hale was already moving. He took the man in the side corridor before the man's hand had even finished reaching inside his coat for whatever he had brought into that building. 2 United States Marshals were on the man 1 second later. They pulled a small, vicious, double-edged blade out of his inner coat pocket along with a folded slip of paper bearing Adeline Thorncroft's full name in an unknown hand. Cassius Crowe was arrested an hour later at the cheap hotel by the Stockyards, sitting at a washstand packing a small valise, still believing his hired man was finishing the job over at the federal courthouse. He did not even reach for the gun on the washstand when the marshals came through the door. He simply closed his eyes and smiled a small, bitter smile like a man who had finally, after many years, come up against the one hand he could not beat. Both men talked. They had to. The deal they were offered was thin, and the alternative was worse. Crowe gave up 3 more aliases. Quintus Hargrove had been using an accomplice in St. Louis who had been forwarding mail and the names of 11 more women whose correspondence had been intercepted but not yet brought to trial. The total number of victims climbed to 52. The total amount stolen climbed past $8,000. Quintus Hargrove was sentenced on the 28th of February to 7 years in the federal penitentiary with full restitution to every named victim. Cassius Crowe got 3 years. The hired knife man got 5 for attempted assault on a federal witness. Adeline Thorncroft stood at the back of the courtroom when the sentence was read, and she did not cheer and she did not weep. She only closed her eyes for a moment, and she thought about her mother, and she whispered under her breath, "We are done with him, Mama." And then she walked out of the federal courthouse in Denver on the arm of Caleb Hale into a sky that was the bright, hard blue of a winter that was finally at long last beginning to end. They rode home to Elk Hollow on the 4th of March. The pine road was muddy where the ice had started to break. The aspens along the creek were still bare, but there was a red softness in their branches that said the sap was starting to move. Silas sang most of the way up the mountain. Wyatt did not sing, but he smiled once, twice, 3 times, which for Wyatt was the same as a man bursting into song. Caleb said almost nothing, but every time Adeline looked at him, he was already looking at her, and the corners of his amber eyes were crinkled in a way she was going to get to know very well in the years to come. On the first evening back at Elk Hollow, after Della had gone to bed early, and the supper dishes were washed, Adeline asked the three brothers to sit with her in the main room. She stood by the hearth. She did not sit down. She wanted to be able to see all three of their faces. "I have thought about this every day since the 23rd of February," she said. "I thought about it on the train coming home. I thought about it this afternoon riding up the Pine Road. I want to say it now before I lose the courage for it, and I want to say it to all three of you at the same time so that there is no misunderstanding between any of us." Silas set his harmonica down on his knee. Wyatt sat forward. Caleb did not move at all. "Silas, the first morning after I came to this house, you put a tin cup of hot coffee in my hand without asking me what I wanted. You made me laugh for the first time in a year before I even knew your last name. You have carved cornflowers into wood and silver for me, and you have taught me how to bank a fire for the night, and I have never once in 4 months walked into a room you were in and felt anything but warmer for being in it." Silas's eyes went very bright. He did not trust his voice enough to speak. "Wyatt, you do not speak often. When you do speak, every word has weight. You left a cornflower on my sewing notebook on the 5th morning. And you never mentioned it, and you never had to. You watched over me all the way to Denver and all the way home, and you put your hand on the side of my face on a porch in January and told me you had known the truth about me from the first moment, and I carried that sentence in my rib cage all through the trial. I am carrying it still." Wyatt nodded once slowly like a man accepting a benediction. "Caleb." She turned fully to him. "Caleb Hale. The first sentence you ever spoke to me on that Pine Road was, 'Ma'am, you are in no danger from any of us.' The second thing you said was that you did not need an explanation from me between that road and your kitchen table. In the 4 months since then, you have not broken a single small promise to me, never mind a large one. You sat a wooden chair outside my hotel room in Denver with your revolver on your knee because you would not sleep until you knew I was safe. I have been loved before in my life, Caleb. My mother loved me. My father loved me. But I have not been kept before. Not the way you keep me. Not the way the three of you keep me." She paused. The fire popped once, loud in the quiet. "I know what your family is. I know what your father came out of the Tennessee hollers carrying, and I know what your mother made of it in this house. I know what you told me in December by this same fire when you said you were not asking me for anything. I have had a whole winter, Caleb, the way you promised me I would. I have had my breath back for a long time now, and I have made up my mind." She took one step closer to the hearth. Her voice did not shake. Her voice had gone past shaking a long time ago. "I want to stay on this mountain. I want to build a life here. I want to build it with the three men who found me in the pine needles. I want to marry Caleb Hale in the eyes of the law of the state of Colorado because the law allows only one. And I want to stand up in front of God and the four of us together and say the words that make me sister and help meet and partner and beloved to Wyatt Hale and Silas Hale in every way that the law cannot reach and does not need to. I want to be a mother on this mountain. I want to sew dresses for every woman in this valley and put my name on a shop door down in Copper Ridge. I want my mother's Bible on the mantle of this cabin. I want my silver thimble on the table in the corner by the window. I want to die a very, very old woman on this porch with the three of you and the children we raised still close enough for me to touch." She was crying by the end. She did not try to stop. "That is my answer. That is the whole of my answer. And I am not afraid of any of it because this mountain chose me and three good men chose me. And I am finally, for the first time in my whole life, choosing back." For a long moment, nobody spoke at all. Then Caleb Hale stood up slowly on the leg that had only finished healing the week before, and he crossed the space between the hearth and her, and he took both of her hands in his, and he bent his forehead down to rest against hers for a single long moment. And he said in a voice so quiet she felt it more than heard it, "You are home now, Addie. You are home now, and you are never going to be anything else. A man keeps his word. You have my word for the rest of my life. Wyatt stood up behind him and put one hand very gently on her shoulder and the other on Caleb's. Silas stood up on her other side and wrapped both his arms around all three of them at once, the way he had probably wanted to do for months. The four of them stood together in front of the fire in the main room of Elk Hollow Homestead, and the wind moved in the pines outside, and the first true thaw of that winter began. Reverend Ezekiel Pinkerton rode up the Pine Road on the 14th of April. The aspens were in the first green haze of bud. The snow was mostly gone from everywhere but the north-facing slopes. The wedding was held outdoors under the old pine tree that Jeremiah Hale Sr. had planted with his own hands the year he built the cabin. Della Ashworth stood as Adeline's only witness in a pale yellow dress Adeline had made her as a gift. Hester Whitlock came up from the town. Alden Hollister came with his wife. Obadiah Tomlin and his sons came. Prudence Vaughn did not come, but she sent a set of embroidered pillowcases and a short note that said, "Only with my good wishes for your new life," and Adeline read it twice and set it carefully aside because the note was a kind of apology, and she wanted to remember it as one. Adeline Thorncroft married Caleb Hale under that pine tree in front of God, and Reverend Ezekiel Pinkerton and about 20 neighbors on a clear April afternoon. And later that night, inside the cabin, by the light of a single beeswax candle on the mantel, with no one present but the four of them, and the Lord Adeline Thorncroft spoke her private vows to Wyatt Hale and to Silas Hale in the same words she had spoken in the church ceremony earlier, changing only the names, and Wyatt and Silas spoke theirs back to her. Silas was the one who cried. Wyatt was the one whose hands shook as he took hers. Caleb sat beside her on the bench by the hearth and held the other hand and did not say anything at all because everything he had ever needed to say had already been said. And then the candle was blown out and the door of the bedroom was closed and the wind moved in the pines outside of Elk Hollow Homestead, and the first true spring rain of that year began to fall softly on the cabin roof. And this chapter of Adeline Thorncroft's story came quietly to an end. The years that came after that April night went faster than anyone in the cabin could have imagined. In the spring of 1879, the vegetable garden went in along the south wall of the house, worked by 4 pairs of hands. In the fall of that year, on a cold, clear night in late October, almost exactly 1 year to the day after a woman named Adeline had fallen in the pine needles with $17 in her hand, a baby boy was born in the upstairs room with a wedding ring quilt on the bed. They named him Jeremiah Hale Jr. after his grandfather, who had come down out of the Tennessee hollers with a promise and a dream. Caleb held him first, and Caleb's amber eyes were wet, and Caleb said to the baby, "Welcome home, son. Welcome home." In the early summer of 1879, Silas and Della were married under the same pine tree by the same Reverend Ezekiel Pinkerton. Their son Ethan was born the following spring of 1880. Lily came 4 years later. The cabin had to be enlarged twice in the first 5 years to hold everybody, and Silas did most of the new carpentry himself, and every doorway in the new wing he had a tiny cornflower carved into the frame where he could reach it without having to stretch. Wyatt Jr. was born in the autumn of 1881. He came out quiet and watchful, and with his Uncle Wyatt's green eyes, and anyone could see from the first month that he was going to be a man of the woods. Martha Hale, named for the grandmother who had died in the snow of 68, came in the summer of 1883, honey blonde and cornflower-eyed and already laughing before she was 3 days old. The herd at Elk Hollow grew from 200 head to 600. The dress shop Thorncroft and Hollister opened on the main street of Copper Ridge in the summer of 1880, with Adeline as senior partner and Della as manager of the front counter, and it became the best-known shop of its kind in that whole corner of Colorado. Prudence Vaughn came through the door of that shop in the spring of 1890 and asked very quietly if Mrs. Hale would consider making a wedding dress for her daughter. Adeline answered her kindly, because forgiveness costs the forgiver almost nothing once a woman has a whole life she loves to stand on, and she made the most beautiful dress the Vaughn family had ever seen. Hester Whitlock died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1895 at the age of 67. She left the boarding house to Silas and Della. The whole valley came to her funeral, and Adeline Hale spoke over her grave, and Silas played a slow hymn on the harmonica that had been Hester's favorite. 20 years after the autumn of 1878, on a bright October afternoon in 1898, Adeline Hale, 42 years old now, with two small streaks of silver in her honey blonde hair, walked out onto the front porch of Elk Hollow Homestead and stood where she had stood on the first morning she ever watched the first snow come down. The aspens in the valley were the same gold they had been that October 2 decades before. The light was the same light. Caleb came out behind her slower now, at 51, a little silver at his temples and a slight favor to the ankle that had been broken in the storm of 1878. He slipped one big weathered hand around her waist and stood beside her without saying a word. Down at the corral, Wyatt Jr., 17 years old and already as tall as his father, was breaking a young horse under the close, patient eye of his Uncle Wyatt. Jeremiah Jr., 19 and broad-shouldered and gentle, was mending a length of fence with his cousin Ethan, who was 18 and already engaged to a girl from Copper Ridge. Martha Hale, 15, honey blonde and blue-eyed, was sitting on the steps of the porch embroidering a pillow slip under the shade of the pine her father had been married beneath. Lily, 14, was chasing the two youngest dogs across the yard and laughing. Silas came around the corner of the cabin with Della on his arm. Both of them were graying too. Both of them were still holding hands after 19 years of marriage. Silas's harmonica was in his shirt pocket, the same one he had carried since the night Adeline had first heard him play Shenandoah by the fire. Adeline Hale looked out across the valley at the life that three good men in one mountain had built around her since a day in October of 1878 when she had fallen in the pine needles with $17 in her hand. "Caleb," she said quietly, "do you remember the first thing you ever said to me? I told you that you had taken the wrong road. No, the second thing. I told you that you were in no danger from any of us. Yes, and the last thing you said to me on that road. I said that a man keeps his word. And you have, every single day, for 20 years. Every one of you has." He turned his face into her hair and did not answer because the answer was not the kind of answer that used words. On the top step of the porch, Martha Hale looked up from her embroidery and smiled at her mother and father without knowing yet why her eyes were suddenly stinging. In the yard, Silas was pulling out his harmonica and starting up a slow old tune that everybody in the family knew without being told what it was. Down at the corral, Wyatt Hale looked up from the young horse his nephew was breaking and caught Adeline's Ike across 50 yards of open ground, and he tipped his hat to her the way he had tipped it to her every single day for 20 years. The wind shifted softly through the pines on the ridge above the cabin, the same pines Adeline had fallen beneath on a dying October afternoon in 1878. The mountain stood above them all, silent and enormous and entirely unchanged. Winter always ends. This mountain chose you. A man keeps his word. You are home now, Addie. She closed her eyes on the porch of the house that 4 pairs of hands had built by hand, and she let the old words run through her one more time, and then she leaned her silvering head against the shoulder of the big quiet man who had carried her off a mountain road in the dusk of her whole life, and she smiled at the valley of Elk Hollow homestead in the gold October light. And that was where Adeline Thorncroft Hale's story came at last, peacefully and fully, and without anything left undone to its end.